This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. My guest today is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Rutgers University. He has authored numerous books and articles, mostly on the subject of cognitive sociology, including, most recently, his 14th book, Don't Take It Personally, Personalness and Impersonality in Social Life. It has just been published by Oxford University Press. Professor Aviatar Zerubbabel, welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you.
So you start with this wonderful quote from Louis Koser, the great American sociologist, that I did not know, and I think it really encapsulates a great deal of your argument, and it goes like this. The sociologist is concerned with King John, not with King John. Can you unpack this for us?
Yes, and the contrast is with the historian who is interested in King John specifically. So the book contrasts two visions of personhood, personalness and impersonality. Personalness focuses on specific individuals, on their particularity, uniqueness, idiosyncrasy, and impersonality focuses on their generic, on the individual as a generic entity. And you talk about social roles, about offices, about positions, and so on. So if you take, for example, Romeo and Juliet, it's a great story of two specific individuals falling in love with one another based on their specificity. But they also happen to be Montagues and Capulets, and that's the tragedy.
Mm-hmm. So really the greatness of work of art like Romeo and Juliet is really about the combination between the two, the personal story and the ability of the author to universalize it?
I think it's about the tension between the two that keeps coming all the time. So when you think about the law, for example, the law is defined on the basis of impersonality. The law treats everyone the same. That's the point. So if I want to know who has the right of way when I get to an intersection, the answer is the car on the right. Who it is beside the point. So it's about the what over the who. And as I also argue later, the how many over the who.
Yeah. We'll get to that in a second, but I'd like to know whether this what over the who is a characteristic of a modern way of thinking, or is it something that is really ingrained in, our mindset?
I think it's ingrained, but there are several things about modernity that encourage it even more. First of all, urbanism that presents individuals as anonymous, much more than in a small village. You can't think of dating websites in a small village, but you can think about it in an urban center. Capitalism, because of the market economy, the standardization of production. So when I go in to buy a shirt, I go to a department store and I have to fit myself into a certain custom size, rather than having a tailor come to me, take my measurements, and do something customized for me. Then there is the automation. I go to an ATM, and who am I interacting with? I'm interacting with an impersonal entity. It's going to become even more so with artificial intelligence. But it's about anonymity, that's the point. So I talk about what I call anyoneness. anyone interacting with anyone. So if I go to buy something in a department store and I'm asked to show IDs, I can feel the personal part of me feels insulted, like, what, you don't trust me?
Or
But that-
flattered if they think you're under 18.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Or actually better understanding that anyone else in my position would have been asked the same thing, and anyone in the clerk's position would have behaved in the same way.
But is it something that you can identify as pre-modern and anonymity and anyone-ness?
Yes, I'm dealing with personalness and impersonality in an ideal typical manner. So I push it to the extreme version, but there have been milder versions in combination before. There's another thing that I didn't mention yet, which is rationalism. For example, the emphasis on objectivity in science, the whole idea of inter-researcher reliability, so that if I gather the data or if you gather the data, we're supposed to get the same results. That's rational science.
Mm.
And that didn't exist in the 5th century BC, for example.
Yeah. But I'm also trying to think whether there's any, like, if I take, for example, the most global worldview in pre-modernity, and that is perhaps religion. And if you can compare Judaism and Christianity, in Christianity, there's this great deal of personalness, right? The figure of Christ as a person that is reincarnated and is embodied and exists in every Christian, whereas Judaism is perhaps more bent on impersonality, right? God is an amorphous notion, and also in categories, right? The chosenness vis-a-vis everything else. I mean, there's a much lesser space for personalness in it. Is this a fair analysis?
It actually touches what I mentioned before about who versus how many. If you're a Jew and you want to communicate with God, you need a certain quorum. You need a minyan.
Mm-hmm.
And a minyan means that I'm not interacting as an individual, but as one of at least 10. Very different than the idea that even in Christianity, the transition from Catholicism to Protestantism allowed the individual much more room in interacting with God without the intervention of mediators, priests.
Mm-hmm. Going back to what we said earlier about modernity and perhaps rationality, I wonder whether this distinction between personalness and impersonality, that impersonality is more the currency of the left, or perhaps like progressive worldviews, from the Marxist division of people into mainly social classes. I mean, this is really the most impersonal you can get, to affirmative action, right? People are judged according to their traits rather than the personality. Whereas personalness is perhaps more associated with the right, or perhaps with conservative politics.
In particular situations, there's also a sequence of whether you start from the personal, move to the impersonal, or the other way around. If my department in the university wants to hire someone, we are talking in impersonal terms. We need a criminologist. We need a sociologist of the family. When the process ends, you have interviewed several specific individuals and you make an offer to a specific individual. The same thing when Joe Biden was running in 2020, he promised that if he's elected, he'll put a black woman on the Supreme Court. And when he became president, indeed, he put not a black woman, but generically, but Ketanji Brown Jackson specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the tension that I mean, that both of these elements are present, but one is foregrounded and one is backgrounded in different situations.
But also the critics of affirmative action say
Yes.
that perhaps the personality is foregrounded excessively as opposed
Right.
to... I'm sorry, the impersonality.
The impersonality. Right. The other context where you see this very well is in terms of the majority rule. And when you look at the works of Tocqueville and John Stuart Mill, they were critiquing, and Aristotle too, they were critiquing the idea of majority rule. Why should this opinion win just because more people are for it? What about if these more people are lesser, quote unquote, people? So egalitarianism is also an arithmetical issue. And I think that left and right there are much more pronounced.
Yeah. But it's also, I think, a question of, the needs and necessities of running, as you said in the beginning of this conversation, of just, we no longer live in a village. So there's a great number of people to manage, and there are some compromises that we have to do.
Right. Well, one of the problems of excessive impersonality, you see in things like profiling and hate crimes, where it starts from stereotypes. You foreground the typicality of the individual rather than the individual. I mean, it has some great advantages. When I go to the doctor, she examine my body, my specific body, but in generic categories. And the whole diagnosis process is one where I have to fit particular types. But there is the other side of the ugliness and dehumanizing part of stereotypes. The idea they all look alike. In the book, I mention something that happened to me when my son was 7 or 8, and I came to the school to pick him up. And the receptionist saw me and said, hello, Mr. Romberg. And I'm not Mr. Romberg. I happened to know Mr. Romberg. He was about 10 years older than me. He had a beard. I didn't have a beard. He was much heavier. He was taller. And he spoke Spanish, and I spoke Hebrew. But for the receptionist, they all look alike on the basis of foreigners won the day.
Mm-hmm. Going back to the left-right distinction, I wonder how you see populism in all this. And specifically, you discussed Donald Trump in the book, and how his really ultra-personalized politics really takes that distinction to the extreme. And I would like to ask you whether it's a backlash or perhaps an attempt to solve that tension that you talk about. Not just Donald Trump. I mean, populism in general. He's just a very colorful example.
Yeah. And I think that Trump is an unusual case in populism because of the emphasis on his individuality. But in general, the idea of basing your authority on your charisma is something that is part of populism. And you see it in cult of personality. When Donald Trump was running in 2016 in the Republican convention, he said, I'm going to fix everything. The specific Donald Trump, the Donald. Biden was talking about himself as a hopeful occupant of a position, the presidency. The contrast is just striking.
Yeah. To what extent do you think that really Trump's success emanates from his ability to tap into the very basic instincts of people, that impersonality, going back to our discussion of modernity, the pervasiveness of impersonality has been sort of imposed on people, and perhaps Trump offers them, to be released from that imposition into a more basic way of doing not just politics, but social interaction in general.
So I'm struck by the fact that there's a term Trumpism, and in Israel, Bibism. It suggests that the individuals who are associated with, originally with those terms, don't have to be ideologically unique or special. Anyway, they can act in a very non-ideological way, which is impersonal.
How so?
How so? What is Trumpism? Is it associated with a particular way of interacting with the world? So there's a certain personal style, but it doesn't necessarily come with particular ideology. Now, in 2024, when Trump is running, he's much more specific about what he's going to do. On day one, I'll do this, and that. It was less so in 2016. You can see it in the whole discussion about abortion, how vague he was about it when he was running. So vagueness goes with impersonality.
No, not necessarily, though. It's also this vagueness can suggest that it's like what's right is really down to the person himself, right? It doesn't matter whether I'm for or against abortion. Come the right time, I will do what's right because it's me, rather than a certain principle.
Right. Well, there's an attempt of personalization, which is very deceptive. When a leader talks to his or her followers in second, talking about you, it's talking to you as an individual much more than you as a crowd. So you think that he's really communicating with me. But that's fake personalization. This is like sending a greeting card, which is the epitome of impersonality, that you have a script that you send to someone and you actually spend time in the store looking for the right way to express what you want to express supposedly as an individual, but it's impersonal. But there is the fake personalization by using, the kind of burnt edges of the paper, or using cursive letters. Cursive letters suggest kind of, this is I'm communicating to you as an individual rather than something that is typed in print and anyone could do it. So I talk, for example, about the patient's chart in a hospital. Patient's chart is full of comments that individuals made, but not as individuals, as doctors or as nurses. And when I read the chronicle of the last few days in a patient's career, it doesn't matter to me that it was written by 6 different individuals, because they were all treated as substitutable, as interchangeable. And this is one of the fascinating things about filling bureaucratic forms and so on. And mentioning, of course, the word bureaucracy, this is another of the distinctly modern phenomena that promote impersonality.
Yeah.
Because the authority of leadership is not in a person, but it's impersonal. One of the things that always impressed me as a teenager was watching an hour or so after the assassination of Kennedy, seeing Lyndon Johnson on the plane swearing in. And it meant that Kennedy, the individual, is beside the point. He was the president, and Lyndon Johnson happens to be the individual who will occupy this position, but it's about positions.
Also, in the same way, but although it's slightly different, the king is dead. Long live the king.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. This is a great example of something that, if you look at it purely in terms of personalness, and you don't take into consideration impersonality, it's oxymoronic. If the king is dead, how can you say long live the king? Well, going back to Koser, where you started, your first question is the specific king is dead, but the king as a social role, as a position, is there forever.
Going back to what you said earlier about the pronouns and the use of language, it's really fascinating because I wonder, it reminds me of a question that, of something that we discussed in our previous interview here at the Tel Aviv Review in 2018, when we were talking about your book, that it was about the taken for granted. Some of the things that we said was really about the difference between different languages, gendered or not. I mean, you write in English, an ungendered language, even though your mother tongue is Hebrew, a gendered language. And here also, the distinction between the personal and the impersonal is really dependent, or perhaps not, and this is what I would like to ask you, on the use of the language, because the pronoun you applies both to you as a collective and to you personally, and sometimes...
But not in Hebrew.
But not in Hebrew. And I mean, maybe it's a side question that we'll get to later, but I'd like to start and to get you to start thinking about it. When it comes to populism, you mentioned it in the context of Trump and other populist leaders talking about you. I mean, but a more distinctive characteristic of populist discourse is really the use of we, of us, right? I mean, this is really the whole point. I mean, we're talking about the people and myself, the leader, the populist leader, as your representative.
Yes, Trump uses consistently the slogan or the phrase, as you all know, as everybody knows. He makes a point that is purely idiosyncratic to him, and he says, and everybody knows.
Yeah.
Because the everybody is the anyone that I was talking about before.
Yeah. But going back to you plural and you singular, I mean, the absence of the distinction in English is really interesting. And I don't speak many languages, but in another language that I speak, which is French, also the you is used for a polite address to the you plural.
An impersonal one.
An impersonal one.
Yes. So the tu is the personal and the vous is the impersonal.
Yeah, and it's irrespective of the plural singular. I mean, you can say vous, the plural form, to a single person as a polite address.
Yeah, but what you call polite, I call impersonal.
Right. Because
the politeness is directed in an impersonal manner. It's not that I'm polite to you as an individual. I'm just a polite person. I would be polite with anyone.
Mm-hmm. Right. By the way, are there any other languages where this absence, where the distinction does not exist? Because it can be, for me as someone who speaks English as a second language, it can be really confusing sometimes when you use the use of the word you.
Well, I think that the part of what I talked about as the tension between personalness and impersonality is that there are situations that are somewhat ambiguous in terms of, are you dealing with me as a unique person, or you as a unique person dealing with me as a unique person? When I get a formal letter and it says, Dear Eviatar, well, who are you to call me Eviatar? We're not in a personal relationship, but it sounds as if this is it. When I get from Netflix a note that since you seem to like this film, you'll probably also like this, and this. What do they know about me?
Yeah.
It's impersonalized. It's through algorithms that are not personal.
Yeah. So perhaps all sorts of, we're talking about scientific rationality, but also statistics is perhaps the enemy of personality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about statistics. I'm thinking about epidemiology. When you hear the daily count of dead people from COVID, it's not who they were specifically, but what they were and also how many they were.
It's interesting because medicine is really where this tension really comes to the fore, because on the one hand you have the science behind you, but then every patient is really an individual. And, we think of bad doctors as ones who don't treat the patients as individuals, but rather than, a collection of symptoms.
The cookbook.
Yeah.
And the metaphor of a cookbook is that anyone would be using it. So you don't have your own stamp as a chef.
I wondered to what extent really your thinking is influenced by, you mentioned Max Weber quite often, and his notions about charisma as a personal trait, and you did mention bureaucracy as like the epitome of the impersonal. To what extent is your thinking really influenced by Weber?
Actually, it's very influenced by Weber, but I was not aware of it, how much, until I wrote this book. I consciously was much more influenced by Zimmel, who talks about impersonality in his essay on Metropolis, the big city, for example, about the difference between coming on to someone, flirting openly, or doing it in a coquettish way, which is just something that is like a play that you do not with a particular person, but with any person. Zimmel makes beautiful observation about a woman who might come to a party with many men with a low-cut dress, but she wouldn't go with a low-cut dress when she goes on a date unless she wants to communicate something very different. So Zimmel was a big influence. Weber, of course, because of the bureaucracy and the charisma on the other hand. And another one is Ali Hochschild and the emphasis on the scripting of emotions. That, one of the things that characterize impersonalization is the emphasis on dispassion. So if I'm being arrested by a policeman, I want to be treated as an imperson by an imperson, rather than the fact that this particular person hates me in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing when I as a professor, when I grade exams, I try to grade them anonymously, so that when I read the paper, I don't know who wrote the paper, so that my personal affect towards that person, negative or positive, doesn't influence my quote-unquote objective stance as a professor.
It's really interesting how Zimmel and Weber, Hochschild is a different story in this respect, but early sociologists from the late 19th and early 20th century made observations that still hold with specific modifications in the 21st century.
Absolutely. I retired 2 years ago, but for 40 years, I was teaching almost every year the first-year course for graduate students in classical sociological theory. And I think it's a must to know these thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's hope that our listeners will take that as a piece of advice from you, Professor Eviatar Zerubbabel. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast again and discussing your new book, Don't Take It Personally, Personalness and Impersonality in Social Life. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And our request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto a Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews, or perhaps even more by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.